Hey guys, so here's the next reading, The Unexpected Guest. Remember to replay these as often as you need to make sure you're following along. The Unexpected Guest. A hush fell over the great hall as they entered. The Phaeacian lords were amazed. Who on earth could this stranger be, and what was he doing with Narcissa? Ignoring their stares, the princess led Odysseus past the long banqueting tables to the far end of the hall where her father and mother sat before the fire. Narcissa explained how she found him and repeated the story of his shipwreck and his longing to return home. When she had finished, the king remained silent. It was Narcissa's mother, silver-haired Ariete, who spoke. "You are welcome in Phaeacia, dear stranger, and we are only sorry that it's misfortune that has brought you here. We'll do all we can to help you and return to your home and family. But now I am curious to know who you are and where you come from. It isn't every day that an unexpected guest comes to Phaeacia." "Wise Ariete, your words are most gracious," replied Odysseus, still kneeling in the ashes of the hearth. "I hope you'll understand if I don't answer your question now. Since shipwreck has brought me to your beautiful land with nothing but my life, I can offer nothing but words of proof of who I am. When I tell you, you'll be astonished. At first, you may not believe me, although as my story unfolds, you'll realize that I know too much to have made it up. But my story is long, as my suffering has been great, and I am too weary to tell you now." Of course, put in King Alcinous, before his wife could reply. "We must let you rest before we ask you to do any explaining. And it's not right," he continued, getting up from his seat by the fire, "that you should kneel there in the ashes while we all stare at you open-mouthed, as if you were a creature from another world. It doesn't matter whether you're the poorest beggar or one of the great gods in disguise. You are our guest, and hospitality demands that we should make all guests feel at home." With these words, the king helped Odysseus to his feet and led him to the center of the great banqueting table, where his favorite son, Laodamas, was sitting. Laodamas got up at once and gracefully offered the stranger his seat. "Now eat and drink your fill," said Alcinous. "Afterwards, my daughter's maids will show you to your bed. Tomorrow we'll entertain you and arrange your journey home." Later that night, alone in his bed, Odysseus prayed once more to his guardian goddess Athene. Surely now he was as good as home. When Alcinous came to rouse his unknown guest the following day, he found him already dressed, gazing at the reddening sky. He was trying to imagine the same sun rising over Ithaca. The king brought good news. A ship was being prepared to carry Odysseus home, and a crew of 52 of Phaeacians' finest young oarsmen had volunteered to take him. They would be ready to sail that evening. Odysseus was overjoyed. Meanwhile, there was to be the entertainment that Alcinous had promised. After a quick breakfast of bread and wine, the king led his guests to the assembly place in front of the palace. Here, the best runners and fighters in Phaeacia had gathered to show off their athletic skill. Odysseus could think of the journey home and nothing else. Nevertheless, out of consideration for his host, he pretended to enjoy the spectacle and applauded each of the winners with apparent enthusiasm. When the games were over, Prince Laodamas, the champion boxer, came up to him and invited him to challenge one of the winners in whichever event he pleased. "Dear Prince," replied Odysseus, "you will have to forgive me, for I have no heart for games today." No, of course not. I understand. And I certainly understand, dear stranger," sneering Euryalus, the champion discus thrower, who in form and beauty looked like Ares, son of the great Zeus and god of war. "You're not in the mood for games because you're scared of making a fool of yourself. I bet the only games that you're any good at are the ones you make money from. You might have the body of an athlete, but you have the heart of a merchant. You've probably never thrown a discus or strung a bow in your life. Yet here you are, mysteriously posing as somebody noble and important." White with anger, Odysseus rose from his seat. "Foolish, insolent boy. I see whoever made you forgot to give you brains, and whoever brought you up forgot to teach you manners. I long for my home, and my mind is filled with many years of sorrow. How could I think of playing games? The tiniest drop of wisdom would have told you that. But since you've insulted me with such ill-chosen words, I shall teach you a lesson." And without bothering to remove his cloak, Odysseus picked up a discus that was larger and heavier than any Phaeacian had used. He spun around expertly on his feet to gain momentum and let it go. He was still weak and stiff after his ordeal at sea, but the goddess Athene was watching over him and gave him renewed strength. The discus flew far beyond the earlier throws. Gasps of amazement traveled around the assembly place, followed by murmurs of admiration. There were no other challengers. As they made their way back to the palace where the huge feast had been prepared, the Phaeacians looked at their unknown guests with even greater interest than before. Now their interest was mingled with deep respect. More than ever they wondered who their visitor could be. Alcyoneus had promised that Odysseus would be entertained, and he was as good as his word. 12 sheep, 8 boar, 2 oxen had been slaughtered, dressed, and roasted. Huge jugs of the best Phaeacian wine had been brought up from the cellar. When his guests were all seated and served, Alcyoneus had his favorite bard, Demodocus, brought out to sing for them. Watching the frail, blind old man led to a seat in the middle of the hall, Odysseus found it hard to believe that he could still perform. Surely his ancient voice would sound cracked and feeble. And how could those arthritic fingers pluck the strings of a lyra? Yet as soon as Demodocus sounded the first note and opened his mouth to sing, the Ithacan knew that he was listening to the music of the gods. Although he had no appetite for the feast, sick as he was with longing for home, Odysseus entirely forgot himself in the Olympian music. Demodocus sang first of the love of Ares, god of war, and Aphrodite, goddess of love, and of the anger and revenge of Aphrodite's husband, Hephaestus, god of fire and forge. The song was both funny and moving, and when it was over, Odysseus led the applause. Then Demodocus began a second song, this time a song of the Trojan War, about the famous fight between Odysseus and Achilles. It was painful for Odysseus to even think of those years of war and his lost comrades. As he listened to the lovely, melancholic song, he was overcome and covered his face with his hands to hide his tears. Alcyoneus saw his mysterious guest's distress, and a question stirred in his mind. However, he had said nothing. And when Demodocus had finished and the applause had died away, he ordered the dancers to take to the floor. To the rhythm of drums and chants, while blind Demodocus plucked his lyra, the young men and women of Phaeacia, led by Narcissa and Laodamas, swayed, leaped, and spun before him. Roused from his misery, Odysseus was dazzled by the display, and he lost no time in praising the dancer. The king was delighted. Listen, my friends, to how well our mysterious guest has appreciated our music and our dancing. Now, before we ask him to tell us his story, let's shower him with gifts, so that wherever he goes, he'll speak well of Phaeacia. And you, Euryalus, should be the first to come forward. Without hesitation, Euryalus rose from his place and turned to Odysseus. He unbuckled his sword and held it out in both hands. Dear stranger, please accept this token and forgive my foolish insult. I beg you to remember the giver of the gift and not the arrogant young fool who abused you. Treasure the sword well. It's made of the fine bronze, and the hilt is pure silver. You can see it's beautiful for yourself. Odysseus took the sword and placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. Euryalus, you've apologized most gracefully. I'll remember you as you wish, and may the gods bless your life. After Euryalus, the 12 Phaeacian princes of rank brought their gifts forward, and Odysseus was soon surrounded by treasure. He was delighted, having lost all of his riches that he had plundered from Troy. At least he would not now be returning home empty-handed. When his gifts had been stowed away in a vast chest and carried off to the ship, Odysseus poured out a glass of the best wine and carried it to Demodocus. Silence fell as he knelt down before the withered old man. Demodocus, I offer you this as a sign of my admiration. All poets and musicians deserve our praise because they sing of human suffering and of joy, explain us to ourselves, and teach us to understand our world. But I praise you above all men because your voice is godlike and your music more beautiful than any I have ever heard. He handed the glass to the blind old man, who took it in a shaking hand. I must ask you one last favor, said Odysseus. Earlier, you sang of the fight between the great Achaean lords Odysseus and Achilles. I would like you to sing of the Achaeans once more, but of a later theme. Sing to us now of the wooden horse that enabled the Greeks at last, after 10 long, weary years, to enter Troy and destroy it. Demodocus beamed with pleasure as Odysseus praised him. Now he raised his glass toward the Ithacan's voice and drained it with the vigor of a young man. He then set down the glass, plucked at his lyre, and began to sing.